So let's start our final round, concluding this highly interesting conference. We have the privilege this afternoon to listen to two eminent legal scholars. Sabino Cassese, how should I describe him? I think he is something like the doyen of research in administrative law, not only in Italy, not only in Europe, but beyond. He teaches at one of the most prestigious academic institutions in Italy, Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa. And he very recently completed his 9-year term at the Italian Constitutional Court, where I think he introduced a tremendous innovation. He was the justice, after many years of practice of that court, who started questioning the lawyers who represented their parties. This was not usual in the Italian Constitutional Court. The judges were sitting there stonewalling and later on finding their decision. Christoph Engel, not Marx and Engels, of course. Christoph Engel teaches in Bonn and Osnabrück, but more important, he is the director of the Max Planck Institute for Research on Common Goods, a director from the beginning, from the start of this institute. And I think it is an institution which brought a lot of innovations to German jurisprudence. And this was scholarship initiated by Christoph Engel, empirical law, behavioral law, law and psychology, etc., things that were absolutely not common in the German legal field. He is, for me, if I said of Sabino Cassese that he is, so to say, the doyen of administrative law, I would say he is, for me, the embodiment of interdisciplinarity. You start.
Okay, with that said, I have to stop because I can't live up to those expectations, but let me do my very best. The organizers of the conference have given me a really challenging task. Not only did they want me to give concluding remarks, they also wanted me to send in an abstract before the conference. That was a difficult one, and I thought I have to take a bet here. I sent in an abstract on something which I think matters for the endeavor, but given the composition of the panel is not very likely to have been extensively met. And happily, I've won that bet. So I hope I can still add a few new points, but I will, of course, do due diligence and first start with, of course, subjective, but view out what are take-home points of this conference. I think we can make those in 3 dimensions. The most important is probably something that wasn't openly the main topic, but to my reading was one of the most important points we were dealing with, namely, what are we talking about, actually, if we say there is a nudge? And we had to answer that question, at least partly, because we wanted to answer the question, how do we evaluate it? But that forced us to say, what are we talking about? And we were touching upon a third one, namely, will it actually work? And I will mainly then have my own contributions to the last point, namely, will it actually work? So what is a nudge? Actually, the term choice architecture is demonic because you believe, oh yeah, it's liberty preserving. And we, of course, learned that this is not necessarily to be taken for granted. A second point we were figuring out over discussion is, do we think something is a nudge because somebody intends to nudge somebody into some direction, as opposed to something is a nudge because it has a nudging effect, and which is the most relevant of the two? We distance ourselves from the rational choice / law and economics approach in that we were understanding more implicitly than explicitly a nudge to be something that's not just the same as a change in the opportunity structure and maybe goes beyond. We had the other demonic word here, which was smart, and I would translate smart into regulation that is even more effective than classic intervention. And that brings me to the last dimension of taxonomy, if you wish, namely, what do we mean if we say manipulative? Is it that we think the addressee doesn't fully notice the intention to get him or her into some direction, or is it, even if I notice it, it's hard for me to counteract it? On the normative dimension, we discussed, I think, a bit more than necessary on the question whether the end is a problem. And I think we could have said more on the question whether the means is a problem. But let's first talk about the end being a problem. Of course, that's paternalism. We talked about that extensively. And a question that might have gotten even more airtime than it actually got is, what's the link between education and paternalism? Is that a related concept? Probably not the same. What about paternalism if it's resting on democratic choice? Is that enough? Or is there still a limit even if the legislator wants it? We had extensively discussed in the last panel about externalities, so I go over that because everything I wanted to say has been said. And we heard about the idea that the counter-nudge is what it is really about, in that some private actor nudges you and the government considers whether there is some counteraction to be taken. Could the means be the problem? We started discussing that more in doctrinal terms, and implicitly, when Gertrude Löwe-Wolf told us, yeah, it's an intervention, then this implicitly said the means is a normative problem, because otherwise we wouldn't start considering it. And this is where I think we could have said even more about something like autonomy cost, or we talked about it under the perspective of dignity. Third question, where we touched upon, but I think we really haven't been saying all too much, that is the question, will it actually work? Let me just quickly list a few points when it popped up. So will it work or do something we didn't think it would be doing? Olive oil versus butter was one of the things. Benedikt Hermann asked, and are the effects sustainable, or do we have unintended side effects? Uwe Volkmann said, and could transparency possibly be counterproductive? So on those occasions, we looked a little bit into the technology of nudging, if you wish. Quoting Oren Bar-Gil, we wondered to which degree, in his case, disclosure or nudging more broadly speaking, is actually a science. And the person who, to my reading, went most intensely into that direction was Christine Erta, by telling us that her authority even generates the evidence before it becomes active. So let me go along that line a little bit with my own contribution, and let's bring to your attention a challenge we haven't been thinking about at all, but I think it should be on our screen. Namely, that we know so little about the actual effects. And in 3 dimensions, we don't know as much as we ideally would want to know. First, we don't really know what we are talking about. So the conceptual underpinning of the behavioral effects is far from clear. And then the effect per se is always, for methodological reasons, discussed in isolation. But out there in the world, they are never isolated. So you have one effect in a context and the same effect in another context, and they are not the same. So these context effects are relevant. And last but really not least, individuals are, in behavioral terms, almost in no dimension the same. So we have to face situation effects and personality effects. Oops, that was one too fast. So on conceptual uncertainty, but let me, for the sake of time, directly go to a little bit of introduction to that point. Another point I'd like to implicitly make, but I can also give it away explicitly, is I think we could have been a bit more data-driven. So implicitly, of course, data was present, but I think it would have been better we had seen the data and could engage with the data and see what we think follows from it in normative terms. And in that spirit, let me go to a little bit of data. The question I want to address is a motivational one, namely selfishness. In the economic textbook, the assumption is everybody is plain selfish and only reacts to monetary incentives. This is wrong. Of course, assumptions can't be wrong, but let's say if you take the assumption at face value, it it's not supported by the data. So apparently, on average, the population is not plain selfish in this narrow sense. But what can we make out of it? In a way, it's good news for regulation because there seems to be a resource, which is individual willingness not to be selfish, on which we can capitalize. But how much can we trust this resource? So this is, in a way, the point I want to address in the next minutes. So what do I use as data? A very simple data from a very simple game, the dictator game. You have one active, one passive player. The active player gets some money from the experimenter, and the question is, does he want to keep it, or does he want to give away anything between everything and nothing? And I have done a meta-study on those games, and overall, the whole amount of data, we can say that on average, participants give 28.35%. Is that much? Is that a little? Does it say people are selfish or not? I'll leave that to you. But at any rate, it's far away from zero to say that the idea everybody was plain selfish is wrong. But why is that so? And here things become quite complicated. The most simple idea would be they're altruistic. So their utility, UI, is from two terms, PI, that's my own payoff, and qualified by some measure alpha, the payoff of somebody else. That would be great news for the regulator because he would just have a resource on which to capitalize. But it's very unlikely to be true. So the next one is already more plausible. That would be inequity aversion. I get some disutility from having more than the other. That at least is irrespective of the other's motives. I only look at payoffs. Something that's even more likely is guilt aversion. I feel guilty if my action, AI, falls short of some norm, AI tilde. And then this norm and where it comes from is critical. So why does it matter? As I said, if it's all about altruism, then it's an unconditional resource we can capitalize on. If it is about inequity aversion, we must make sure that the perceived equity balance is fine. So we already have a policy question here. If it's guilt aversion, the next Russian doll is out, namely, where does the norm come from? Is it open to legislative shaping? Or is it more an endogenous norm, meaning that I look around in my community, and then the question is, how do I perceive others around me? That is then relevant for how much trust we can put into that resource. And in terms of policy intervention, capitalizing on terminology from the climate change dialogue, we could, of course, say, okay, here is a conceptual problem of uncertainty, let's do something about it. So that will be a mitigation approach. And then, good news for me, more money for my institute. So we have to do more basic research. And with respect to this, maybe one could do that. An alternative approach would be adaptation. Let's take it as is and let's try to work on it. And I already touched upon that. So if it is inequity aversion, if we believe the evidence in favor of inequity aversion, we would say what we need is perception management. If it's one of those norm ideas, we need very different interventions. Context effects next. And let me again quickly go to the data here. So the same game as before, now I split the data up by the recipient being just an ordinary other participant in the lab, as opposed to the recipient being in some dimension deserving. The typical case is a charity. You see, charities get much more. So apparently this is something that matters. Okay, we take it into account. Next thing, age. So the students are most selfish. They give 27%. Children give a little more. Middle-agers, like most in this room, give something. And we don't have that many pensioners here, but the pensioners are noteworthy for giving a lot. Okay? Again, piece of news, we might work on it. But now, combine the two. Now you see something very interesting. We replicate the difference in terms of deservingness for students and old age people. For children, we don't have the second dimension because there is no experiment. But for the middle-agers, the effect reverses. I wouldn't put too much trust in that specific finding because it's from a meta-study, and there can be other elements in the composition of the sample that are relevant for that. But what it illustrates is that if you have two dimensions only, your empirical question already becomes quite complicated. And situational factors are quite likely not 2, but 10 or 20. And that means you quickly run into something empirically quite challenging. You could still say, let's do the basic research. So at Bonn, Armin Falk is running a huge study that basically tries to catalog that stuff. So maybe at the end of the day, we will have something like a taxonomy in multiple dimensions. But already here, you wonder whether adaptation isn't possibly more relevant. And you would then want to engage in instruments like experimental legislation. Or you would say, I know that I do not know, but I want to do something about this problem. So the legislator would then knowingly engage in taking calculated risks, and you would have to weigh the false positives versus the false negatives. So that would be a kind of normative discourse you would then have to go into. Third dimension is personality, or you could say the heterogeneity. And let me again go to the data. Now, for everybody who has ever seen data, you know this is not a standard distribution. It clearly is not uniform. It clearly is not normal. It's not just noise. You have discernible groups. And they're easy to see. You have 36% in the gross sample. It's 20,000 data points, or quite something. You have 36% who are plain selfish. You have another peak at 0.5, so that's the equal split, that those who share what has been given to them between the recipient and themselves in equal sums. And then you have a few who give everything, and the rest is spread out. So apparently, in this one dimension, the selfishness dimension, we have discernible heterogeneity. Or putting it in psychological terms, personality matters. And now comes the next thing for which I could have given you data, but then the presentation becomes a bit complicated. The situational factors and the personality factors actually interact. And differential psychology has long shown that the only thing you have any chance to do good prediction is defined interactions between personality and situation. And I guess now you have understood why we have a problem of combinatorial explosion. So even if Armin Falk gets it right with his huge exercise in terms of situational factors, he would still treat the group of participants as uniform, which he knows they are not. So still more money into research? Maybe, I take it. But I don't think this is the plausible thing to do. Experimental legislation, difficult, because you would want to hold stuff constant. And there are so many dimensions that only in single dimensions you can hold it constant. So probably something on which I have written a whole book a few years ago, namely two-step intervention, is something that might be relevant. So you first intervene with the interest of making behavior more predictable, more standardized, and then in the next step intervene into your standardized behavior. Or you could do something which Cassese, it's a pity he's not in, is working on quite extensively. He calls it personalized defaults. So the idea is we use the same stuff that Google and Facebook is using. And what's the conceptual thing that happens here? You forget about theorizing. All you're interested is prediction. So you do huge data sets, and by huge I mean huge, millions of data points, with the interest of identifying good predictors of behavior. And the overall goal is to predict as precisely as possible with as little input as possible. So you're hunting cues. And that is something which Google and Facebook tell us is quite effective. And the legislator could, of course, do the same. And then you would be regulated by the cues that have good predictive power. It's obvious that this raises a number of constitutional concerns. And that's a question we may want to discuss, or again, taking a calculated risk. What's the bottom line? I did want to make your life harder, but not with the intention that we should forget about behaviorally informed design of institutions or about nudging. Only I think we should understand that it is far away from being a panacea, and that we should be hesitant to do it just technocratically, and it's something very old-fashioned, a call for humility. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now your account.
Yeah, maybe more light. My purpose is to list questions. You will see many overlapping questions, raise new answers, new questions and problems, and wrap up. And I will make 3 points. And the first point, I would like to frame the issue of nudging. In the second, I would like to present 3 different approaches to the legitimacy problem. And the third point, present some thoughts on how can nudging be legitimized. The topic of this conference was not nudging, but was choice architecture in democracies, and was exploring the legitimacy of nudging. But we have been discussing a lot about nudging, and so some general remarks on nudging are therefore necessary. I shall try to summarize those questions in 6 points very quickly. The first point is nudging a part of an American or British debate that we are freely importing in Europe or not? Now, my answer is in part positive, and I see an historical parallel. As in the 1946 Administrative Procedure Act, you remember, notice and comment, was a reaction to the New Deal interventionism. Nudging may be interpreted as a reaction to the environmental and welfare reforms done by Presidents Clinton and Obama. Also, the way in which nudging is presented as a third way between paternalism, why not interventionism, and libertarianism, why not liberalism, seems to be very peculiar of the American political culture. Or on the other side, nudge may be presented as a mainly British problem. As Britain is a typically interventionist state, but with a strong component of Thatcherism or post-Thatcherism, in perennial search of a third way. Yeah. I never think is it good to find a third way, because I always remember the fascist experience with corporatism as a third way in between capitalism and communism. And the connected problem is the following. What happens when one transposes or transplants nudge in a different environment, less sensible to the amount of state constraint on private parties? Now, in spite of the origins of this problematique, as the French say, the study of nudging is important also for non-Americans and non-British people for at least 2 reasons. The first, which are obvious, the first is that the 20th century revolution in government has put on the shoulders of the regulatee a great burden, and it is difficult in every country in the world to increase mandatory regulation without people's reaction or revolt. And the second is that nudging calls the attention of the regulators and also of the administrative law scholarship on the targeted people and on their behavior. This was once not relevant, being important only the obligations imposed by the state. So nudging presupposes that induced compliance is important. This is my first point. The second point which emerged in this discussion in these 2 days is the following. There's a difference between nudging and letting private parties nudge. The central theme of this conference has been nudging by administrative agencies. But there is also another side of the problem, that is regulating private nudging, as in the Microsoft and Google cases before the EU Commission. Here, third parties are affected by private nudging, and these cases were reviewed according to antitrust standards, which cannot be applied in other cases, of course. Third point, which is more complex, is nudging and regulating. I think that it is better not to get lost in the enthusiastic literature on nudging and place nudging in the real world that is made mainly of state command and control by various means, from mandatory to persuasive, and ask the following rich list of questions. First question, pushing to the extremes. Could modern governments abandon coercive measures and rely only on nudging? Can we be governed by nudging? The answer is obvious. Second question, can nudging replace the traditional regulation as an alternative to it, or can it be complementary to traditional regulation? Third question, up to which point can nudging provide an alternative to the traditional expensive and coercive government instruments? If nudging is difficult to implement, or if we do not know enough about its effectiveness in each field, would it not be better to replace it with more honest and direct instruments, command of control or incentives? If nudging can be complementary, can it be dominant approach or the default approach? How can one choose between mandatory regulation and nudging? Should we consider the alternative only when nudge does not deprive third parties of protection? Can nudging, the easy way, divert or distract from more honest and efficient regulatory measures? How far can we go with nudging? Is this a miraculous instrument? Or, on the contrary, expectations are too high? What nudge counts for in the overall regulatory context? Putting nudge in the context of government regulation of society and the economy, will nudge amount to more than 0.1% of the entire picture? Can nudge be considered as a general regulatory instrument, or is it area sensitive or context sensitive? For example, nudge works better in the environmental sector, but less in other areas, or is more effective in Anglo-Saxon countries than in non-Anglo-Saxon countries. In other words, is there a problem of cultural dependency? Are there alternatives different from traditional mandatory regulation to nudging, education, persuasion, moral suasion? My simple answer is that nudging works only as part of a complex package of regulatory and fiscal measures. And therefore, there is a new question: what are the implications of nudging for traditional state regulation? A fourth set of problems is in whose interest? What is the purpose of nudging? Is nudging in the best interest of the affected people or in the interest of the affected people as interpreted by the rulers or in the interest of the public at large? To convince people to quit smoking is only good for their health or is good also for the society at large that can afford to spend less money for their health? How much choice? Nudging allows to reach collective goals with minimal interference with private choice because it is or appears to be the less restrictive means for the government to reach social goals. But how much choice is left to the people? Is not nudging introduced in order to influence people's decision? And finally, how much effective? This is really a black hole. We don't know enough about the effectiveness of nudging, as there are very few studies on the performances of nudging. So I have concluded my first set of questions, and I move to the second, which is much easier. And this has to do with the question, should nudging be legitimized? Now, I think that to this question there are three possible answers. The first is the following. Nudging does not amount to law, does not impose, suggests, is liberal, does not involve the exercise of authority. As a persuasive and non-coercive instrument, it cannot raise problems of legitimacy, given that it leaves choice to the regulatee. Second answer, the use of nudge tools is marginal, peripheral, interstitial. It has minimal impact on private parties and on administrative agencies, therefore cannot pose problems of legitimacy. Third answer, influence and persuasion are not less restrictive than coercive regulation, interfere with citizens' choice, manipulate individuals' behavior, deprive them of freedom. Nudging is regulation in new form, may be considered nicer, but is not basically different. Even if it is choice-preserving, nudge needs justification, needs to be legitimized. I think that nudging requires to be legitimized for two reasons. One is very simple, because shapes choices and channels behaviors, interfere with self-determination and freedom, and does it by stealth. Using a less restrictive instrument, the regulators nonetheless interfere with free choice. Secondly, the second reason why it is important to try to legitimize nudging is that nudging is based on and exploits bounded rationality and cognitive errors. But such imperfections are not equally shared by the regulatee. Industries and large associations are better equipped, have more resources to cope with nudging. This increases inequalities and produces new asymmetries. And therefore, it is important to make nudging legitimate. Now, the most important part of the story comes now, and I don't have many questions and many answers, and it is, how can nudging be legitimized? Which are the means to reduce the risks of abuses. There are ex-ante measures, avoiding technocratic manipulation through transparency, making in the sunshine the choice of the regulatory instrument through the assessment of the regulatory impact, open to participation. Publicity can reveal methods and motives, reasons, so no hidden nudge. But is transparency the only or the best instrument to legitimize nudge ex ante? Are there other instruments in order to legitimize ex ante nudges? Second, parliamentary authorization. Should nudging be necessarily prescribed by the law as provided by the European Convention of Human Rights? And can nudging be subjected to the principle of legality? How can Parliament discuss the introduction of a nudge? A negative answer has been given by those who fear that nudging may lose its characteristics, features, and become hard law through the process of legalization through the Act of Parliament. But if not authorized by Parliament, nudges become necessarily technocratic instruments. And finally, ex post measures. Can nudging be controlled by courts? I mean by constitutional courts, but also by administrative courts, because they provide protection for individual parties in special cases, in cases or controversies. But are the courts equipped to review nudging? Which are the tools at the disposal of courts to evaluate nudging? Reasonableness, balancing, proportionality, suitability. Can courts be empowered to review the de facto effects of informal administrative action? Given all those questions, I would conclude with the words used by Anne van Aken before. We should be careful with the brave new word of nudges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to react immediately, or?
Maybe just one
Please.
doctrinal point, because it came up in the morning and it might be a good idea to make that, to start a debate on that. The difference between standard traditional regulation and a nudge is that with traditional regulation, one thing is for sure. You forbid something or you change the incentives. And you do that clearly for everybody. With a nudge, you are sure that you will only reach some addressees. So we move from a world of deterministic into a world of probabilistic intervention. And I think this is something we want to reflect in our legalistic way of dealing about a potential intrusion, not a sure intrusion.
From the point of the state?
Yeah.
Yeah, from the point of view, because the national government is not able to understand what is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, then I invite remarks, questions from the audience, please.
Just a retort maybe to that. Is that really true? Because if we think about sort of standard regulation, prohibition or incentives, people react different to nudges because they're different people. People react different to incentives due to their utility function for money or whatever. And people react different to prohibition. So is that really a sort of shift, or is it not just the same thing, just a different dimension?
Question goes to you, I think.
In a way, you are right. But with standard regulation, the claim of, say, the Constitutional Court looking into is this an interference with fundamental freedoms is straightforward. You will say there may be a few people who are able to counteract it quickly, but the ordinary addressee certainly can't. Whereas with the forms we have been discussing here, like framing, individuals react extremely differently to framing, so that if I wanted to defend the intervention in court, one plausible counter-argument would be, please first show me that it actually impinges on freedom. Whereas this is something that with traditional intervention, you are not likely to face.
Who else?
If I may add,
Sure.
In the case of mandatory regulation, you are obliged to comply. If you don't comply, you are fined. And in many cases, the state can replace your non-compliance by directly acting as an actor and replacing your inaction. So in a way, you are sure that you reach your goal.
Wagner.
I want to comment on the paternalistic feature of nudges. So I'm only talking about cases where this tool is used to make people better off on their own terms or according to their own ends. And examples include the food regulations where you print calorie levels on foodstuffs and so on. And the longer we talked about it and the more examples we heard, it struck me that we move farther away from these well understood and rather harmless cases where you just inform consumers about what they actually eat and move more towards pushing them in a certain direction of being slim rather than obese, of being non-smokers rather than smokers, of being non-drinkers rather than drinkers, of being organ donors, of being a person who always drives safely, and on and on and on. And while every example is, of course, has its merits, and while there are people among us in every category who certainly deserve a nudge or would benefit from a nudge in the right direction, it is still, I think, a problematic case, given the heterogeneity of the population, to sort of re-educate the population as a whole in order to cope with problems that a certain fraction of the population has. For instance, the proposal to print calories and other things on restaurant menus is something I at least would find rather offensive, going to a restaurant and then, engaging or being nudged to think about the calories that I eat. That may be my personal problem, but if on a large scale the state promulgates a policy of what the right way to live is, namely being slim, healthy, sportive, all kinds of things, I think this is that gets to a point where many people maybe feel harassed in one dimension or another, and it raises the question whether it's really the business of the government to help people become better people, better characters, less affected by vices, more rational, more sober, and stuff like that. This is something. It's like, it sounds a bit, if you carry it to a farther, it sounds a bit like a gigantic re-education program where people are pushed in a direction that the benevolent government thinks is the right way to live. And even if there's still the possibility to opt out, I think it is, as the nudge literature or the behavioral literature has shown, this comes at a considerable cost. The same reasons that help explain why people may behave in a defective way according to their own interest, the stickiness of defaults, for instance, will also suggest that it will be difficult for many people to evade the nudges that the government posts into their lives. And so in this purely paternalistic area, I doubt whether a full-fledged policy of nudging people into the right direction is the right way to go.
I think this is very interesting on several dimensions. First, I, of course, a bit parochially, think that was a nice contribution to saying uncertainty is a key element in the whole normative debate. Because you said, I don't believe that this leaves preferences unaffected. That's an empirical question. And it is normatively relevant, I would follow you, that it does or that it does not. So is the intervention actually liberty preserving? The term choice architecture conveys the idea that it's just up to them to use it or not use it? Or should we factor in that, at least for most addressees, and now we go back to the probabilistic element, it will probably change what they want, not just how they react to stuff. So the educative effect, to go back to Uwe Volkmann's intervention, is something which we could use almost as a measure measurement rod when we want to understand how we normatively address the thing. The second dimension, which I think this was a very interesting intervention, is if now we put on our lawyers' hats and say, in court, what could possibly be done about it? Then we will have to face the question, what are we looking after? Intention? So is it necessary for factoring this into the normative debate that we can show that the regulator actually was aware of this effect and was even shooting for the effect? Or are we content with showing that the effect is there? My hunch would be we should do the latter. But if we do the latter, we of course open Pandora's box, because everybody who hates some form of intervention will be able to make a case that it has a preference-affecting effect, and in and of itself, that may not be enough to strike it down. And the final point, which I find this is a very interesting intervention, is I said in my introductory slides, we have been, to my reading, been discussing too much about possibly problematic ends. And we could have discussed much more about whether some means are per se problematic. I'm not saying problematic in the sense of should be forbidden, but need justification. And if something has an educative effect, then I would say this is enough in my reading to make it a normative problem. We may still want to follow Uwe Volkmann and say we can't avoid education at the end of the day, but at least we should have a debate over, do we want to have this form of education about this issue?
Can I answer with this another question? But don't you think that always in the law is implied an educative effect, and that we accept as everyday life? I mean, traffic lights, they educate us to behave in a certain way. So every command and control has an implied educational side. Why do you criticize nudge just because it has this educational side effect? Yeah, sure. Of course, this is a question.
Two reasons. One is, I think not everybody needs education. For instance, it may be a good idea to nudge people into not drinking too much who are prone to drink a lot. But if I imagine I would buy a bottle of wine with some decomposed liver with a picture of that, I would feel harassed, and I would believe that I don't need this kind of education because I'm not in danger of being an alcoholic, and I don't want to be confronted with an educational program that is not designed for me. And this is only one example. Everybody has his own vices or virtues, and if you have a policy that is designed for groups facing particular risks but affects everybody, I think it makes everybody's lives less, let's say,
pleasant.
less pleasant. Yes. This is, and this I meant with the heterogeneity of people, that you do that with regard to everybody. You limit the freedom of everybody, and if it works, then it will affect everybody. It would be naive to say that, oh yes, only the ones who are the target group will actually change their behavior, and the others will opt out. As we learned, they don't all opt out, or opting out is costly, in a psychological sense costly. And therefore, this is one answer. And the other is, with regard to the main health risks and others I can think of, I think we are doing, all Western societies do the nudging all the time, and even sometimes even further, for instance with cigarettes or with traffic safety, not driving too fast, not to drink too much, and so on. There are regulations and nudges in place in every country. So if now somebody comes along and says, we need much more of that, I ask myself, where is the problem you want to solve? What else must be now looked at anew in order to implement nudges that we don't have but miss so much? I must say I don't miss so many nudges, and while I would acknowledge that there are always new problems every other year, I'm not. My feeling is not that there is not sufficient public awareness, governmental intervention in so many forms in order to make people more healthy, safer in their behavior, and on and on. And I must stress, I'm only referring to this, as I think now, as I learned from this conference, rather narrow category of nudging, where it's only done for the benefit of those subjects who are nudged. I believe that many of the examples that we discussed during the last 2 days are not at all, in this sense, only for the benefit who are nudged, but for some public good. And then the discussion must change, because then the alternative is whether you want harder forms of regulation or this rather soft one. And this is more an instrumental debate. What is the best regulatory tool? But when we're talking about this, the core of the nudge program, I think it raises these concerns rather than the heavy-handed ones.
Mm-hmm. Sabino, would you like to react? Or?
Well, I share his point of view, but you are complaining about the uniformity, yeah. Second, expansion and size, and third, for nudging, which are only addressed to one person, not to one person in favor of a third party.
The last point I didn't want to make.
Yeah, but
more interventions, please, Jeff.
I just want to reply to Professor Bachner's intervention. If really your main concern about nudging is that this information is insulting in some way for you, or you take some offense to it, then we should balance the weight of that consideration versus the extraordinarily well-documented and widespread benefits that regulation is bringing. So if you find warning signs on cigarette packages offensive, just think of how many millions of lives those warning signs have protected. And I think there's no question what's more important.
Protected against the choices of the smokers, right?
Yes, I think
these are these arguments that you save lives by changing the behavior of people. You're sort of nudging them to save their own lives. This is a policy I would question in general. I'm questioning whether it is the duty or an objective of government to change people's preferences so that they live longer than they otherwise would.
What's your basis,
I don't want to make overbroad arguments and say this is all forbidden ground, but the simple plea to say, oh, we save so many lives, we would save a lot of lives by by forbidding, for instance, certain sports, by limiting speed on roads, by limiting flying, air travel, all kinds of things. And we don't do that because people make these choices and often obviously value these activities. And so I think the simple argument, we're saving lives, is just too weak to support these interventions into the decisions of people.
I think, as a very brief rejoinder, we do all those
Very
things you just
simple.
mentioned. Yeah. We regulate risky sports. We don't let people hang glide off the Empire State Building. And we do regulate in all those areas you just mentioned for good reason.
You. Yes, please.
Stefan Marken, Bochum. I'm puzzled by one question, and that is, what are the normative standards for judging the legitimacy of influencing preferences? So in Anne van Aken's presentation, she had a very strong view on this question, and for her it seems any change in preferences, any governmentally induced change in preferences is problematic per se. Not necessarily manipulative, but problematic. But on the other hand, it seems that influencing preferences is the standard case of an effective regulation, even with taxes or with mandates, because those usually only work because they are not enforced in most of the cases. So we assume that in some way the governmental regulation changes preferences in the sense, or in the direction of compliance. And this, the first question is, what could be criteria to judge the legitimacy of preference change induced by government? And the second is a caveat. Maybe there's a bias, a judgmental bias in our discussion on those effects, because what's different between nudging and the standard case of regulation is that with nudging, the government has an explicit intention to change preferences, versus in the usual case, it's just a non-intended side effects. And there's huge literature in moral psychology telling us, well, non-intentional side effects we treat as in tendency morally irrelevant, whereas intended effects we treat as a case for moral responsibility. These are the standard trolley cases. So that's my question. Thank you.
I find that an intriguing and a difficult question. But let's follow up on what you proposed. If government intervenes and says, from now on, it's criminalized if you smoke a cigarette, as opposed to what government currently does, could you say that in this criminalization, the intention to shape people's preferences is less present? I would say it's as present as in the current. So we are discussing about an intervention that, in terms of hard constraints, does nothing, compared with an intervention that combines a hard constraint in terms of a negative utility that is coming on you if you don't comply, with the same intention. And we usually haven't discussed criminal law in those terms. I'm not saying that this is correct. I just wanted to make sure that we understand what we are talking about. Actually, we had a little bit touched upon the debate some 15, 20 years ago when there was an intense legal debate over governance by changing incentives. Because if you do just incentive changes, you could at least claim that you can be ignorant about preference changes because you don't care. All you care about is the change in action. And whether people also change their preference or not is none of your business. So you could say, in a way, the incentive regulation is the cleanest form of not doing it. But I can make the same exercise as a second ago with your example. If you have criminal law, isn't that an incentive change? Of course it is. So you could say that all forms of regulation inevitably impinge upon, and then we come to your deepest issue, namely, is intention worse than non-intended side effects? And here I made that point early on in our debates. I would say on political economy grounds, I wouldn't do it. Because this is an open invitation to regulators to write up stuff in a way that stands up before the Constitutional Court. And they just must be smart enough not to be found out. But they will, of course, want to shape preferences. So ultimately, I think what we have to think about is what does our Constitution say about educative exercises? And I guess this is from where we would have to build the rest.
Well, suppose that in a country a law is enacted which, by nudging or by explicit incentives, pushes entrepreneurs, firms, to invest in one area of that government. And suppose that people are not happy with shaping their behaviors in this way. And suppose that they bring the case to the Constitutional Court. What would say the Constitutional Court? It is legitimate, provided that it is proportional, that it does not go beyond the purpose for which has been enacted this statute by the Parliament. So there are criteria to check the legitimacy of that measure, given as a measure, as an incentive, proper incentive, or as a hidden incentive in a nudge.
I have 3 more names on my list. There's now a 4th one. I would like to close the list here unless there is a very urgent 5th question. Okay. And would it be all right with you if we take the 4 together?
Yes.
Okay. Then Chris McCradden, please.
Is there.
Thank you. Thank you. So it's I'm afraid, a continuation of the previous dialogue, and it relates to this preference-changing attempt by government. And it relates, I think, to one of the points that was being made this morning about anti-discrimination legislation, which I think is actually, of all of the examples, the one that comes closest to, for me, to raising this question centrally. The reason why it raises the question centrally is because there's a debate within anti-discrimination law and anti-discrimination policy as to what the aim is. Is it effectively to change behavior, or is it to change preferences? So it becomes not just, as it were, a sideline of the question of regulation. It becomes a central issue within anti-discrimination law as to what the purpose of the regulation is. Personally, I've always been very uneasy in that context about preference change arguments for anti-discrimination law. Partly because I come back to the point I think that was made earlier on. I don't think it's any of the government's business what I think in this area. I think it's absolutely right for the government to be concerned with the actions. So, whether somebody who is gay is hired or not is, I think, a very relevant question for government. What I think about gays, that's up to me. So the question is central to anti-discrimination law. Where I think it becomes really, really complicated is this question about indirect effects as opposed to the major intention behind the legislation. And there, of course, it is inevitable that one of the effects may well be over time to change the preferences because people become conventional, and if they don't act on particular preferences, then that's likely to change other people's preferences because they don't think then it's acceptable, and then they internalize it. But that's a much longer process, a much more indirect process. And so I'm very taken, I think, with this distinction. But then the objection comes about, then what do you do about constitutional review? And I think the problem has to be left as a problem. I think the distinction is so important for our moral sensibilities that I'm afraid we just have to leave the problem where it lies. If it causes a problem for constitutional review, I'm afraid that's it.
I have a question and not a comment disguised as a question, so that's good. I wasn't referring to your question, by the way. I was just sorry. I think I'm partly turning back a question that was asked to me, which is that there have been a lot of talk about the need for governments to be more transparent and to justify their decisions. At the same time, we know that that's a form of power, is to focus a narrative on certain type of evidence or disguise some certain type assumptions as truth. So my question to you is, if you were to change three things in the way the current issues are discussed, what would you change? Or whether that would mean that there should be more evidence? Don't take that, this is a nudge, this is just sort of to clarify the question. Kind of, so to provide more evidence, or maybe you would like to expose certain assumptions that actually should not be treated as assumptions about what is good and what should be promoted, or something like that.
Gebhard Kirchgessner.
Thanks. First, very short, I would also think we should be very careful, speaking of changing preferences. As economists, we are used to changing restrictions, and changing restrictions change behavior, and whether changing behavior has anything to do with changing a preference is very open. And if we do not make this clear distinction, our theory loses nearly all its power. In so far, it's from a methodological point also difficult. But the question is to Christoph Engel. First of all, these dictator games always use with money as a gift. If we change the situation a little bit and the people have to earn the money, then the share the first player gives to the second player drops dramatically. We have purely selfish behavior. And then the question is really, what can we learn for the use of nudges from all these experiments? I know these experiments, and I'm familiar with the literature, but for me it did not become clear what we now can learn for our subject here from this experiment.
Thank you. My intervention is a comment, not a question. And I would like to point to the fact that if we're talking about changing preferences, and I think that's pretty much the core of much of the debate that has been going on, then we have, and we think about the legitimation, then obviously collective self-binding is what comes to mind. But I think when we think about collective self-binding, we should not neglect the political economy dimension of the story and see that institutions themselves develop an own logic, and that also interferes, and that questions of, power, or however you want to frame it, in whichever disciplinary context, become relevant. And that probably some of our unease with the change in preferences comes with this dimension. That the political process is not as discursive as we all would like it to be.
So there is one, if I understand it correctly, one very last intervention.
Yes, there is. Thank you very much. There's a very last intervention from the internet again, from Anne van Aken, which is not surprising given her frequency and her following this live stream. And she says, let me clarify that I have a problem with intentional preference change of what people deem good for themselves. It's even more problematic, says Anne van Aken, if this preference change is manipulative or hidden. It's okay to shape preferences, e.g. concerning environment. And perhaps to conclude, Anne van Aken's comment, she says, again, she agrees with you, Professor Cassese, that each law is also expressive and is implicitly educative. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I'll try to piece things together, and the one thing that came up most was this idea of government intentionally or effectively doing something about preferences. And I think we have, myself clearly included, to plead guilty here, because the term preferences is very bad in this context. As Gebhard Kirchner rightly reminded us, it's a technical term, it's used by economists for good reason, because they want to explain changes in behavior by changes in the opportunity structure, and they must hold something constant. And that's what they do, by assuming that preference, not saying that it is so, that preferences are given. A term that might help us here would be on the one extreme, a very psychological concept, and probably if you want to understand effects, that's the road to go. That is to talk about attitudes. So attitudes are combinations between social construction and the assessment of what I construe, and that goes hand in hand. And we could see to which effect nudges change attitudes. So if it's effects-based, I think this is the most likely candidate. If what Christopher McCrudden was more interested in, if we are more interested in a normative debate about the criteria to say under which conditions we want or we want not government to intrude, then I wouldn't want to talk about preferences, but I really would want to talk about liberty. And we would need a clear definition of what we mean by autonomous choice as opposed to no longer autonomous choice in a dynamic dimension. Because this is what education is about. The individual at point 1 in time would have chosen differently from the same individual at point 2 in time, because in the mid-time there was this intervention by government that possibly changed how this individual sees things, to say it in non-technical terms. And we will want to understand under which conditions we find this is a liberty problem. So this is how I would try to go about it. Let me then not go in order, but first say something about Emmanuel Taufik's point, which I think would have been a wonderful agenda for a new conference, namely the political economy of nudging as compared to traditional regulation. So if I am a selfish regulator who wants to achieve something, under which conditions am I better off going for nudging as opposed to something else? Or how does it change the games I am playing with my electorate or with my veto point holders? So there's a whole apparatus that could be nicely applied to that issue, and I think it would be very fruitful doing that. And of course, it's almost surprising that it took so long to come up, the external validity challenge to experiments. Here my standard response, I think, is good for this context as well. Experiments are tools that are deliberately extremely artificial because they want to achieve one thing, that's identification. So we want to be sure about cause and effect. And we pay a big price. This big price is that we want to make a claim, in this case, about selfishness being a relevant factor in social interaction under conditions that are only analogous to what we really want to understand. And I, by now, have stopped talking about external validity. I mean, if my referees want me to do so, I'm happy to do so. But I think a much better way is to say, this is the identifying assumption that we are making. Namely, that by going to the lab and distilling what we claim is the essence of something, gives us interesting information about something out there in the world. And in the case of selfishness, I would be mildly optimistic that it's not all experimenter demand effects.
Okay. Last word goes to you.
I don't have 3 suggestions, but only one. And is the following. Transparency is not enough. Nudges requires much more, and this is participation in shaping nudges, making clear the purpose and discuss with the affected people. So the old traditional notice and comment, public inquiry and cat public procedure is the only measure in order to keep nudging under control.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have the impression we could go on for another half day. And
yes,
we have already
even more.
a proposal for the next conference. This is not possible now, so let's thank our final speakers for their thought-provoking observations. And now the very last word is for the organizers of the conference.
Yes.